since the old days. But anyway, I refer to this as the cryptocracy. And this is what really runs this country. They're everywhere. Maybe somebody in this room, I don't know. I've met a few, and I've heard horror stories about how they treat their own. Basically, they eat their own young. They have no compassion. They have no conscience. They have no morals. What about the Cold War? What was the Cold War all about? Well, the Cold War was a ruse to enrich the national security establishment, and also what President Eisenhower warned us of, something called the military industrial complex. And how they did this was through terrorizing us with the idea of mutually assured destruction. In other words, a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. And we had this thing called the arms race. We would build 5,000 warheads, the Russians would build 5,000. We'd build 5,000 more, they'd build 5,000 more. We would build the anti-ballistic missile system, they would build an equivalent system. So this kept going on till we started having these, what they called SALT talks, Strategic Arms Limitations talks. And then Mr. Ronald Reagan came out with something called SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars. And allegedly, this was so overwhelming to the Russians that they said, "Uncle, we just can't compete with you." Well, that was a lie too. In my opinion, there never was a real threat of war between the United States and the Soviet Union. What was actually happening is we were working at the highest levels together to develop what is generally known as black projects. And I'm going to talk about black projects in length a little bit later on. But these projects were developed very aggressively behind the Iron Curtain, because you have to remember this was a closed society at one time. You couldn't have a team from a news service just go out and start investigating the KGB or any of the research facilities in the Soviet Union. It just wasn't permitted. It's hard enough in the United States to get any honest answers from our officials, but it was much worse in Russia. So how did our political differences finally dissolve? Well, this is going to sound very strange, and I don't mean to talk over anybody's head. I'm going to try to bring this down to a very fundamental level, because it's really almost master's level physics, and I've studied it for a long time, and I still have difficulty with it. But I'm going to try to bring it down to a way that you can understand it and it can make some sense to you. But anyway, the political differences, in my opinion, collapsed after the emergence of something called the new science. This included new physics, which encompasses things like quantum reality, also nonlinear dynamics. And what this did is this actually began to bring science and religion together. It's beginning to allow mankind to play God. I call this techno-shamanism. Back in the old days, they had these, what they called shaman, which were basically medicine men. And they used all sorts of occult techniques and herbs and different incantations to affect different outcomes. Now we use technology. We use supercomputers, like the Cray 4. Actually, the Cray 4 was the fastest computer in the world 5 years ago. It's obsolete now. What the supercomputers allowed us to do was to actually model heretofore hidden or occult knowledge. Occult knowledge used to be printed or bound in very cryptic books, and it was circulated within, let's say, certain groups like the Wiccan religion or something, and only they knew the meaning or understanding of what this material was. Now through the supercomputers, again, like with the Bible, they have deciphered much of this information. And they've come up with something called fractals, to name a few: fractals, neural networks. And basically what this has allowed science to do now is to manipulate DNA, time, space, matter, and most importantly, direct contact with non-human intelligence. Now let me say something about non-human intelligence. The word demon comes from the Greek root daemon, D-A-E-M-O-N. Literally translated, that means disembodied intelligence. And this is what I believe the national security establishment is dealing with. That they are attempting to harness these forces for military and intelligence applications. And I'm going to quote from a letter that was written to me from somebody from one of the national laboratories that actually described some of the grotesque and horrid experiments that are going on in these areas, specifically known as psychotronics. Let me try to give you an example of what I'm talking about. This right here probably looks like one of those ink blot tests or something you've seen. Well, technically this is known as a Mandelbrot set. And it's got certain characteristics. One, it's bilaterally symmetrical. In other words, one side is a mirror image of the other. And also, if you look at any node of this Mandelbrot set, what you see is a representation of the whole image. So if you look at this part, zoom in on it, it looks like this whole image. If you look at this part, it looks like this whole image. If you look at this tip right up here, it looks like the whole image. You can go on to infinity, and it's all self-similar. And now they've been able to, using very simple equations, actually create images of living forms such as trees, sea life, even rough images of human beings. Okay? Now, what this represents technically is the boundary between stability and chaos. And I think everybody here has a general idea of when things are stable and when they're chaotic. But let's look at a practical example. Let's take your heartbeat. I know many of you have had the electrocardiograms, and if you look at the electrocardiogram, kind of, goes along rhythmically, beats at a regular rate. That's called normal sinus rhythm. Now when you have a heart attack, if you look at the EKG, it just is kind of going all over the place. There's no periodicity, there's no rhythm, it's just going crazy. This is known as going from a stable state to an unstable or chaotic state. And this is just one example of many things in living and non-living systems. For example, boiling water, an explosion. There are just hundreds or thousands, literally thousands of different examples of systems where they can model these systems going from stability to chaos.